Guatemala City, 2001. The market in Guatemala City was a place that seemed to exist outside of time. The stalls stretched out like a labyrinth, filled with colors, smells, and sounds that blended into a chaotic yet fascinating cacophony. It was the kind of place where you could find everything from exotic fruits to ancient crafts, and where every corner seemed to hide a story waiting to be told. I was a young journalist, obsessed with finding those stories. Not the ones that appeared in newspapers, but the ones whispered in hushed tones, the ones people told around campfires or in dark bars. The stories no one else wanted to hear. That's why I was there, in that market, with my camera hanging from my neck and a notebook in hand. I walked among the stalls, observing every detail. The vendors gave me curious looks, but I was too focused on my search to pay them any attention. Until, suddenly, something stopped me. In a secluded corner, almost hidden among piles of fabrics and wooden crates, there was an old woman. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, as if each one told a different story. She wore a long, worn dress, its color somewhere between brown and gray. But what caught my attention the most were her eyes, dark, piercing, as if they could see beyond the obvious. I approached her cautiously. At first, she said nothing, simply staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Finally, she extended her hand and showed me a small object, a carved wooden amulet with symbols I didn't recognize. "This will protect you," she said in a hoarse, deep voice. "But be careful with what you seek. Sometimes the stories that haven't been told don't want to be discovered." I took the amulet skeptically, but something in her tone made me slip it into my pocket. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, she was just an old woman in a market, and I had a honeymoon ahead of me. A few months later, Elena and I arrived at the estate on the outskirts of Mexico City. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by forests and with a small lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. The house was old, with high ceilings and stone walls, but it was well maintained. It seemed like the perfect setting to start our life together. The first day was wonderful. The sun shone over the lake, and the air smelled of flowers and fresh earth. Elena and I spent hours exploring the surroundings, laughing and planning our future. But everything changed that first night. It was late when the rain began to fall. The sound of the drops hitting the roof of the estate was soothing at first, but something in the atmosphere made me uneasy. I decided to go out to catch something for dinner despite the rain. Elena stayed inside, reading a book by the fireplace. The lake was dark, and the rain created small ripples on its surface. I sat on an old wooden bench, fishing rod in hand, and focused on the task. But it wasn't long before I felt like I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The wind whistled through the trees, and the shadows seemed to move strangely. But then something changed. The air grew colder, and the sound of the rain seemed to muffle, as if something was absorbing all the noise around me. I stood up from the bench, looking around. There was no one there, but the feeling of not being alone was overwhelming. I decided to head back to the house, but before I did, something caught my attention. On the ground, right next to the bench, there was a dark stain. I crouched to examine it more closely and realized it was a puddle of water, but it wasn't rainwater. It was thicker, darker, and smelled like something I couldn't identify. I returned to the house trembling, soaked by the rain and with my heart racing. Elena asked me what had happened, but I didn't know how to explain it. I decided not to tell her anything, thinking that maybe it had been my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the darkness. But that was only the first night. The next day, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining again, and Elena and I spent the day together, trying to forget the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. But when night fell, the unease returned. This time, it was Elena who noticed something strange. We were sitting in the living room, enjoying a cup of tea, when she suddenly stood up and looked toward the window. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her face filled with concern. "Hear what?" I replied, standing up. "It sounded like a whisper," she said, walking closer to the window. "It came from the garden." I joined her and looked outside. There was nothing there, just darkness and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. But something in the way Elena looked at me made me uneasy. "It must have been the wind," I said, trying to calm her. But deep down, I wasn't convinced either. From that night on, things began to get worse. Small details that had seemed insignificant at first became impossible to ignore. Doors opened and closed on their own, objects disappeared and reappeared in strange places, and always that feeling that we weren't alone. It was then that I remembered the amulet the old woman had given me at the market. I took it out of my pocket and examined it under the lamplight. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to glow faintly, as if they had an energy of their own. "What's that?" Elena asked, looking at the amulet with curiosity. "Something I was given in Guatemala," I replied. The old woman said it would protect me. Elena didn't say anything, but her expression changed. It was as if something about the amulet had disturbed her, though I couldn't tell what. That night as we slept, something woke me. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a presence. Something was there, in the room with us, watching us from the shadows. I woke up startled, my heart pounding. I looked around, but there was nothing there. Yet, the feeling that something had been in the room was impossible to ignore. That was the first sign that something was very wrong at the estate. But it wasn't until the second night that everything changed forever. That was when I saw her for the first time, sitting on the raft, wearing that old dress and with those white eyes that seemed to stare straight into my soul. The second night at the estate was the one that changed everything. After the strange events of the first day, I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. Maybe the fatigue from the trip, the change of environment, or even the rain had played tricks on my mind. But that night, there was no way to rationalize what happened. Elena and I had decided to spend the evening together, trying to distract ourselves from the unease that had taken hold of us. We had an early dinner, a simple but comforting meal, and then sat in the living room to talk. The fireplace crackled softly, and the warmth of the fire helped us relax. But as the night went on, that feeling that something wasn't right returned. "Do you think this place is weird?" Elena suddenly asked, looking toward the window. "Weird? What do you mean?" I replied, though I knew exactly what she meant. "I don't know," she said, shrugging. "It's like someone is watching us." I didn't know what to say. That same feeling had been haunting me since the previous night, but I didn't want to worry her more than she already was. So I just smiled and told her it was probably just the change of environment. But deep down, I wasn't convinced either. It was around midnight when it happened. Elena had already gone to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, and the silence of the night was almost oppressive. I decided to take a walk around the estate, thinking the fresh air would help me relax. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. I sat on the wooden bench, the same one I had been on the night before, and stared at the water. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then something changed. The air grew colder, and a light mist began to form over the lake. I stood up from the bench, feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I saw her. Sitting on the raft in the middle of the lake was a woman. She wore an old, weathered dress, its color somewhere between gray and brown. Her hair was long and ashen, and her eyes were completely white, as if they had no pupils. I froze. She didn't look directly at me, but I felt her presence in a way I can't explain. It was as if the cold of the night had concentrated in that spot, enveloping me in a sense of oppression. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She didn't respond. She just leaned forward slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward me. Though she had no pupils, I felt her staring straight into my soul. "Leave," she whispered, her voice seeming to come from far away. "Leave before it's too late." At that moment, the raft began to move toward me, though there was no wind or current pushing it. I stepped back, feeling fear take hold of me. When I looked again, the woman had disappeared. I returned to the house trembling, soaked by the rain and with my heart racing. Elena asked me what had happened, but I didn't know how to explain it. I decided not to tell her anything, thinking that maybe it had been my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the darkness. From then on, the woman's presence became more intense. We saw her in different places around the estate, in the garden, by the lake, even in the hallway of the house. She was always there, watching us with those white eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical. After the woman appeared on the raft, Elena and I decided we couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. The estate, which had seemed like the perfect refuge for our honeymoon, had become a nightmare. But we couldn't just leave without trying to understand what was going on. So, the next morning, I decided to investigate. I started by talking to the nearest neighbors. The estate was relatively isolated, but there was a small town a few kilometers away. There, I asked the locals if they knew anything about the history of the estate or if they had heard rumors about strange occurrences. Most of the people I spoke to seemed reluctant to talk about it. Some looked at me with suspicion, others simply shrugged and said they didn't know anything. But finally, in a small shop in the center of town, I found someone willing to talk. He was an older man, his face weathered by the sun and his hands calloused from years of hard work. He looked at me curiously when I asked about the estate. "The estate by the lake?" he asked, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might hear. "Yes, I know something about that place, but it's not a pretty story." He invited me to sit at a table in the back of the shop, and there, amid the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of flies buzzing around, he told me what he knew. Many years ago, the estate had belonged to a wealthy family. The owners were a young couple, newlyweds, who had bought the property as a place to start their life together. But it wasn't long before things started to go wrong. The wife, a woman named Clara, began to act strangely. She became withdrawn and paranoid, saying that someone was watching her. Her husband, a man named Eduardo, tried to help her, but he didn't know what to do. Finally, one night, Clara disappeared. They searched everywhere for her, but no trace was found. The only clue was an old, weathered dress they found floating in the lake. Eduardo was devastated, and it wasn't long before he abandoned the estate and moved away. Since then, the estate had passed through several hands, but no one stayed for long. Everyone said the place was haunted, that something evil lived there. And now, after hearing this story, I was beginning to understand why. I returned to the estate with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Elena asked me what I had discovered, but I didn't know how to explain it. Instead, I decided to look for more clues within the estate itself. That's when I found the diary. It was hidden in an old chest in the attic, covered in dust and forgotten for years. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but I could still make out Clara's shaky handwriting. I began to read, and with each page the story grew darker. Clara wrote about her fear, about the feeling that someone was constantly watching her. She spoke of strange dreams, of a woman in an old dress with white eyes who followed her around the estate. And finally, in the last entry, she wrote something that chilled my blood. "She's here. I can't escape. She's calling me from the lake. I have to go." As I read the diary, I remembered the amulet the old woman had given me at the market in Guatemala. I took it out of my pocket and examined it under the lamplight. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to glow faintly, as if they had an energy of their own. "What's that?" Elena asked, looking at the amulet with curiosity. "Something I was given in Guatemala," I replied. "The old woman said it would protect me." Elena didn't say anything, but her expression changed. It was as if something about the amulet had disturbed her, though I couldn't tell what. That night, as we slept, something woke me. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a presence. Something was there, in the room with us, watching us from the shadows. I woke up startled, my heart pounding. I looked around, but there was nothing there. Yet, the feeling that something had been in the room was impossible to ignore. I can't explain who that woman was or why she chose us. All I know is that her presence disturbed us so much that we decided to leave the estate earlier than planned. Even now, years later, I sometimes feel her eyes watching me from the shadows. And that amulet the old woman gave me in Guatemala, I found it broken on the floor of the estate just before we left. After discovering Clara's diary and understanding the history behind the estate, Elena and I faced a difficult decision. Should we leave immediately, abandon that place, and try to forget everything we had experienced? Or should we stay and face whatever was happening? Elena wanted to leave. "This place isn't safe," she told me, tears in her eyes. "We can't keep living like this, in constant fear." But I couldn't let it go. As a journalist, I felt I had to get to the bottom of the story, to understand what had happened to Clara and why her spirit seemed trapped in that place. Besides, something inside me told me we couldn't just run away. We had to face whatever was there. Finally, after a long discussion, we decided to stay one more night. I wanted to try to communicate with Clara, to understand what was tormenting her and, if possible, help her find peace. That night, everything was ready. We had prepared candles, incense, and some objects we had found in Clara's diary, things that seemed to hold special meaning for her. Elena was nervous but determined to support me. We sat in the living room with the candles lit and Clara's diary open in front of us. I began to read some of the entries aloud, trying to summon her presence. At first, nothing happened. But then the air grew colder and the candles began to flicker. "Clara," I said aloud, trying to stay calm. "If you're here, we want to help you." That's when we heard her. A whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Help me," the voice said. "I can't escape." Elena grabbed my arm, frightened, but I pressed on. "What's wrong, Clara? Why are you here?" I asked. The voice grew stronger, clearer. "She trapped me. I can't leave." "Who trapped you?" I insisted. But before she could answer, the candles blew out all at once, and the room was plunged into darkness. We heard a loud noise as if something had fallen, and then a blood-curdling scream that froze us in place. When we turned on the lights, Clara's diary was gone. In its place was an old, weathered dress, the same one I had seen on the lake. That's when it all made sense. Clara wasn't trapped by her own will. Something or someone had trapped her in that place, preventing her from resting in peace. And now that same presence was haunting us. I decided to investigate further. digging through historical records in the town and speaking to more locals. Finally, I uncovered the truth. Clara hadn't disappeared by accident. She had been murdered by her husband, Eduardo, who couldn't bear her erratic and paranoid behavior. He had drowned her in the lake and then faked her disappearance to avoid being caught. But Clara couldn't rest in peace. Her spirit was trapped in the estate, tormented by betrayal and pain. And now, her presence was growing stronger, trying to communicate with us. Elena and I knew we couldn't stay at the estate any longer. But before we left, we decided to do something for Clara. We held a ceremony by the lake, where we read her diary's final words aloud and asked her to find peace. That's when we saw her for the last time. Clara appeared in the middle of the lake, wearing her old dress and with her white eyes. But this time, there was no fear in her gaze, only sadness. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing into the mist. We returned to the house, gathered our things, and left the estate for good. Even now, years later, I sometimes feel her eyes watching me from the shadows. And that amulet the old woman gave me in Guatemala? I found it broken on the floor of the estate just before we left.